let's get into what was happening in this video back here. So in this video, we can see that this middle cell here is just about to undergo apoptosis. You can see as it starts to contract and then it starts to break apart into all these blebs, we're going to call them from now on. All right, so let's have a look at the steps in apoptosis. So we're still on page 7 and there's a few gaps here. So the first thing, and this is a bit hard to see in that video, but the cell begins to separate from the other cells. Now, a lot of these, they don't have to be done. I've done them in an order, but they don't have to be done in that order. If you mentioned the steps, it's kind of like transcription where there are 4 steps in transcription. So long as you mention all the steps, it shouldn't really matter what order they're in. Some of them make a bit more sense. So this separation from the adjacent cells or the cells that are next to it is due to the collapse in the cell cytoskeleton. So if we see our cell over here and it has this cytoskeleton that's all within it, now that cytoskeleton is helping to maintain the structure. If that cytoskeleton starts to break down, what happens is this whole cell becomes a lot more blobby. So it might have been held out like this, and as you break down the inner membrane, all that happens is the cell becomes a blob, and it's going to try and form as circular a shape as possible. And that was obvious in that video back before. As a result of that, so all 3 of these things, I would almost say that this happens first, yeah? You get the collapse in the cytoskeleton within the cell. So here is the cytoskeleton within the cell. And as a result of that collapse, you get separation from adjacent cells and the cell begins to shrink. Now, after the cytoskeleton has started to collapse, there are other parts in a cell as well. So remember that there are organelles. Okay, so here is a mitochondrion. Here is our nucleus with our nucleolus and lots of DNA in it. So that's a really bad nucleus. We might also have Golgi apparatus over here. Okay, so what's going to happen is they are going to start to break down. So you're starting to see that the Golgi will break down, the nucleus will break down, the mitochondria will break down. Now, all of that kind of happens, and now we've got this big kind of cell soup. Now, this cell soup is just made up of molecules. It's no longer made up of organelles, it's just broken down molecules. So what happens is the cell itself begins to bleb. All right, now what do I mean by blebbing? Blebbing is, and I'm just going to give myself a bit more space down here. Blebbing is where it kind of looks like it's forming vesicles all at once, but what it's actually doing is breaking apart into a lot of smaller mini cells, yeah, or mini packets of cells. Now, these little bits here are surrounded by plasma membrane still, but they're still very controlled. Now, sometimes you can call these membrane-bound vesicles apoptotic bodies. You don't need to call them apoptotic bodies. It's okay if you kind of ignore this point. Now, you can just talk about the blebbing. Now, after the blebbing, those blebs, those apoptotic bodies, and I'm just going to get rid of my top picture here, so you can see there, these apoptotic bodies begin to be, so this here, this green one that I've just highlighted, that's what we call an apoptotic body or a bleb. You can also call it a bleb. All right, now you can see here that these are the apoptotic cells. You could see all these little blebs that were forming before. Now what happens is we've got white blood cells in our body. Now we haven't gone through what white blood cells do yet, but what their job is in apoptosis is to come along and engulf them. Yeah, so phagocytosis means that they are engulfing. And you can see that engulfing happening up the top here. So the blebs or the apoptotic bodies are being engulfed. So to me, I know it says that there are 7 points here. In terms of ones that you really need to talk about when you're talking about the steps in apoptosis, I always talk about the collapse of the cell's cytoskeleton. I always talk about blebbing. Yeah. I like to also mention the cell shrinkage. So if you are really struggling with this, they are the 3 take-home points that you really, really need to know when it comes to apoptosis. The phagocytosis is what happens after the steps in apoptosis occur, but let's just have another look. So you don't need to look at this change in refractive index. That's beyond the level of your study design. But you can see here that the cell is beginning to shrink. It's beginning to separate from the adjacent cells here in this second picture. Now the membrane then begins to bleb and the nucleus begins to break down. So now we've got these apoptotic bodies forming in the last picture, and we get phagocytosis by surrounding cells or by white blood cells. Here's another picture to show you what's happening. Here's the cell undergoing apoptosis. You can see that things are breaking down. We can see blebs are forming. Now these blebs, we're going to call them apoptotic bodies. And what happens is you get phagocytosis by a nearby cell. So there's a whole bunch of different pictures. Here's another one just to re-illustrate the point. You've got cells that are damaged or stressed. So they might have DNA damage within them. They start to bleb. The cell begins to shrink and form blebs. Now, you don't need to know about the enzymes that attract macrophages, but macrophages are white blood cells. Then it breaks into these smaller pieces and they get eaten. And so that's it. If we go back to these steps, really, really hone in on the collapse of the cytoskeleton, the cell shrinkage, and the blebbing of the plasma membrane. They're our main steps in apoptosis. What happens to those blebs afterwards is that phagocytosis. And that is the end of what are the steps in apoptosis.